The Galactic Collective had a saying, and forgive me, I am going to translate this loosely, because the original phrase involves a sound that human vocal cords simply cannot produce, but roughly translated, it meant, never mistake silence for weakness. Ironically, the Collective said this constantly, posted it on every diplomatic vessel, had it carved above the entrance to their Grand Senate, and then proceeded with breathtaking consistency to make exactly that mistake every single time a human walked into the room. This story begins on a station called Varath 9, which orbited a dying orange star at the edge of what the Collective called the Fringe, the polite word for the places we don't bother developing, because nothing interesting ever happens there. Varath 9 was a training hub for junior diplomatic attachés, wildlife researchers, and what the Collective officially called cross-species integration specialists, which was just a fancy title for people who got sent to places nobody else wanted to go. The station itself was enormous, humming with thousands of species, political maneuvering, career ambitions, and the general low-grade anxiety that comes from putting beings of wildly different biological needs in the same cafeteria. There were Velhari, tall silver-skinned creatures, who communicated partly through subtle bioluminescent pulses along their necks. There were Grotheni, stocky and four-armed, known across the galaxy as the best structural engineers in 12 sectors. There were Tsuvari, bird-boned and fast-talking, who had colonized more star systems than anyone else, and never let you forget it. And then there were the humans. The humans numbered exactly 11 on Varath 9 at the time of these events, 11 out of a station population of roughly 8,000. They were treated, as a general rule, the way you treat a new intern on their first day, with polite tolerance, mild condescension, and the quiet assumption that they would need things explained to them slowly. The Collective had only formally recognized humanity as a spacefaring civilization 43 years prior. 43 years. In collective terms, that was basically yesterday. Some of the senior staff on Varath 9 were older than humanity's entire presence in the galaxy. So when Priyanka Morrow arrived as a junior wildlife researcher, fresh from her training cohort on Earth, carrying 2 bags, a battered field notebook, and the general energy of someone who had absolutely no idea how much she was already being underestimated, nobody paid her much attention. She was assigned the smallest residential unit on the station. She was given a data terminal that was technically functional but hadn't been updated in 6 years. She was partnered, initially, with no one. Her assigned mentor, a senior Tsuvari researcher named Advisor Kelithos, looked at her intake file, made a sound like a politely disgusted songbird, and requested a reassignment, citing what he logged as insufficient prior experience for meaningful collaborative output. In plain language, he didn't want to waste his time on a beginner. Priyanka was given a revised assignment, solo preliminary fieldwork on the station's lower biome decks, a series of environment-controlled habitats housing creatures too dangerous, too complex, or too diplomatically sensitive for standard research access. She was told this was standard procedure for junior researchers, which was partially true. What she was not told was that 3 previous junior researchers had requested immediate transfers out of the lower decks within their first week. The creatures down there had a habit of making beings feel very, very small. She went anyway. The lower deck smelled like a dozen different ecosystems had been compressed into one long corridor. Wet stone, something metallic and sharp, the ghost of something organic that you couldn't quite name. The lighting was amber, low, designed to minimize stress responses in the animals. Priyanka walked the full length of the observation corridor on her first morning, with her notebook open, and her eyes doing that thing humans do when they are genuinely, completely absorbed, quick, darting, missing nothing. The first habitat she stopped at contained a Ruvath. If you are unfamiliar with Ruvath, and statistically speaking, most people are, because most people never get within 100 meters of one voluntarily, they are roughly 4 meters at the shoulder, armored in overlapping plates of biological keratin that could deflect a military-grade plasma round, and they have 2 sets of eyes, 1 pair for standard light, 1 pair for reading heat signatures. They were used historically as war beasts by 3 separate civilizations, before all 3 civilizations quietly decided that controlling a Ruvath was, in practice, far more trouble than it was worth. The Ruvath on the lower deck was named, in the research logs, Subject Orrakh, though the staff who had to walk past his habitat every day had taken to calling him the problem in their informal notes. Orrakh had injured 2 maintenance drones, destroyed a feeding apparatus, and developed a pattern of watching anyone who approached his habitat with an intensity that the senior researchers described in their official reports as concerning and in their private conversations as deeply unsettling. Priyanka stopped in front of his habitat and looked at him. He looked back. She did not move. She did not make any of the usual sounds. No nervous laughter. No hurried writing while backing away. No careful, deliberate distance. She just stood there, reading his posture the way you read a language you've spent a long time learning. His weight was shifted left, which in Ruvath body language indicated heightened attention without aggression. His secondary eyes were open, which meant he was tracking her heat signature. His plates, which would have lifted and fanned out in a threat display, were flat, neutral, waiting. After approximately 4 minutes, which, for the record, was 3 minutes and 50 seconds longer than any other staff member had ever voluntarily remained stationary in front of Orrakh's habitat, Priyanka wrote something in her notebook, nodded once, very slightly, and moved on. She did not know it, but Orrakh watched her walk away for a long time after that. Over the following 2 weeks, she moved through the lower deck habitats with the same quiet, unhurried approach. There was Shura, a Velhari classified apex ambush predator from the Nessic swamp systems, who had never allowed any researcher to remain in visual range for more than 30 seconds before displaying aggression. Priyanka spent 40 minutes sitting cross-legged on the observation floor, not writing, just being present, until Shura came to the glass herself. There was a breeding pair of something the research logs called Garvel, which looked, honestly, like someone had taken a manta ray, given it legs and then made it angry, and the female of the pair, who the staff had nicknamed Brenna in the logs, because her official designation was 14 characters of non-human phonemes, had developed a stress behavior of circling continuously that nobody had been able to interrupt. Priyanka interrupted it on day 3 by mirroring the movement from outside the habitat, then gradually slowing. Brenna slowed with her. None of this was being watched by anyone who mattered. Priyanka filed her preliminary observation reports through the standard system. They were auto-sorted into the junior researcher queue, which had a review backlog of approximately 3 months. Advisor Kelithos, who had rejected her as a mentee, did not read them. Station Director Omarvan, a senior Grotheni administrator who ran Virath 9 with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 60 years and found most of it predictable, did not read them. The only person who happened to glance at her reports was a human Lieutenant Commander Yusuf Adelikon, the station's single human senior staff member, who had earned his position over 22 years in the collective's administrative corps, and who had developed as a survival strategy the habit of reading everything filed by humans on the station because nobody else would. He read her Week 2 summary on a Tuesday, went back and read Week 1, then sat quietly for a moment thinking thoughts he did not immediately share with anyone. What he was thinking was, this is unusual. He forwarded her reports to one person, Dr. Savera, the station's head xenobiologist, a Velhari researcher of considerable reputation, who had spent 60 years studying animal cognition and cross-species behavioral dynamics. Dr. Savera was not the sort of person who got excited easily. She had seen a great deal. She read Priyanka's reports in one sitting, then read them again, then used a comm channel she hadn't opened in 3 years to call Yusuf back. "Who is this person?" Dr. Savara said, in a tone that was not quite a question. "Junior researcher, arrived 5 weeks ago." A pause. "She's not using any of the standard approach protocols." "No," said Yusuf, "she's not. Brenna has been circling for 8 months. Orrakh hasn't permitted sustained proximity contact from any researcher since his intake." "I know." Another pause, longer this time. In Velhari bioluminescent language, which operates partly on an involuntary level the way human facial expressions do, the light patterns along Dr. Savera's neck were doing something that translated roughly to, "I am recalibrating my assumptions, and I find this mildly inconvenient. I want to observe her," Dr. Savara said finally. "I thought you might," said Yusuf, and he almost smiled. 3 days later, Dr. Savara stationed herself at the observation level above the lower deck corridor and watched Priyanka work. She brought no equipment. She told no one she was there. She spent 2 hours watching a 26-year-old human sit, move, wait, mirror, adjust, doing things that Dr. Savara had spent 60 years trying to systematize, to protocolize, to teach, doing them instinctively, doing them correctly, doing them in ways that should not, by any reasonable measure, have been accessible to a species that had been in space for 43 years. The Garvel male, the one the staff never bothered to name because he was so aggressive he'd never permitted enough observation for anyone to feel comfortable naming him, pressed himself against the observation barrier when Priyanka was near it. Not in threat posture. In the posture, Dr. Savara noted, with something close to disbelief, of seeking proximity. She called Yusuf again that evening. Where did she study? Dr. Savara asked. Earth. Small university. Nothing notable in her academic record. Mid-range marks. One outstanding thesis on behavioral adaptation in large predators. One thesis. Yes. The bioluminescent patterns shifted again. She has no idea what she's doing, does she? Yusuf considered this. I think, he said carefully, that she knows exactly what she's doing. I don't think she knows that nobody else can do it. Dr. Savara was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that, again, I am translating loosely, meant something along the lines of, the collective is going to have a very uncomfortable few years. She had no idea how right she was. Because here is the thing about being unnoticed, about being assigned the smallest room, the outdated terminal, the habitats nobody else wanted. It gives you a great deal of unobserved time. And Priyanka Morrow had been using every minute of it. She had not, as it turned out, been simply observing. She had been building something. The something she had been building was, on the surface, a research document. Technically, if you squinted at it from a certain angle and applied a very generous definition of the word document, in practice, it was a behavioral mapping system, a living, cross-referenced index of communication patterns, stress indicators, proximity preferences, and emotional states for every creature on the lower decks, built from scratch, without any of the standard collective research frameworks, because Priyanka had looked at the standard frameworks in her first week and quietly concluded that they were, in several important ways, wrong, not complete, not outdated, wrong. The collective xenobehavioral research tradition was 600 years old, which sounds impressive until you realize that 600 years of tradition can calcify into 600 years of unchallenged assumptions. The foundational texts had been written by Tsuvari researchers in the early expansion period, and the Tsuvari, for all their brilliance, were a species that communicated primarily through speed and volume, which meant their entire framework for understanding animal behavior was built around visible, high-intensity signals, threat displays, flight responses, territorial vocalizations, the loud, obvious stuff. They had been systematically underweighting the quiet stuff for 6 centuries, and nobody had noticed because the quiet stuff was, by definition, easy to miss. Priyanka had not missed it. Her document was 412 pages long by the time Dr. Savara formally requested to see it. It included behavioral notation systems she had invented herself, cross-species comparison charts, that should not have been possible without decades of fieldwork, and a 17-page section on Orrakh alone that made Dr. Savara set down her reading tablet halfway through, stand up, walk to the window of her office, look at the orange star outside for a long moment, and then sit back down and finish reading without stopping. She brought it to station director Omarvan the following morning. Omarvan was a Grotheni of the old-school, methodical, skeptical, deeply suspicious of anything that arrived without proper institutional credentials behind it. He was also, which is relevant, 63 years into a career that had taught him to recognize the difference between things that were merely surprising and things that were genuinely significant. He read the executive summary Savara had prepared. He looked at the charts. He asked 3 questions, received 3 answers he did not have an immediate counter for, and then did something that was for Omarvan, the administrative equivalent of a dramatic gasp. He cleared his afternoon schedule. Word travels on a space station the way it travels in any small community, faster than anyone intends, and in all the wrong directions simultaneously. By the time Priyanka was formally summoned to a senior staff review, which she received as a notification on her 6-year-old terminal, while eating lunch alone in the junior researcher cafeteria, half the station's upper administration already knew something unusual was happening. The other half would know by dinner. She arrived at the review room, which was designed for 12, and currently contained 19 people, several of whom were standing because there were not enough chairs, which told you something about how urgently this meeting had been assembled. Wearing the same field clothes she'd been in all morning, with her battered notebook under her arm, looking precisely as unconcerned as someone who does not yet know they are standing in the middle of an avalanche. Advisor Kelethos was there. He had, upon hearing about the meeting, immediately inserted himself into the proceedings, on the grounds that as a senior wildlife researcher, he had obvious relevant expertise, which was technically true, and also contained the faint, sour taste of a man trying to position himself adjacent to something he'd previously decided wasn't worth his time. Priyanka noticed him. She said nothing. Dr. Savara opened the meeting and spent 11 minutes walking the room through the core findings of Priyanka's document. There was silence of a specific quality in that room, not the silence of boredom or skepticism, but the silence of people recalibrating, which has a particular texture to it, a kind of collective held breath. Then came the questions. There were many. Most of them were directed at Savara, which is what happens when a room full of senior staff encounters a junior researcher's work. They instinctively redirect their engagement toward the senior person who is presenting it, because their brains haven't yet caught up to the fact that the senior person is presenting it precisely because she did not produce it. Priyanka answered. Anyway, from her seat at the far end of the table, quietly and precisely, without hedging, without the performative deference that junior staff usually deployed in rooms like this, she just answered. Correctly. Every time. Kelethos, to his credit or discredit depending on your perspective, waited until 20 minutes in before saying what he clearly felt needed saying. The methodology is unconventional, he said, in the tone of someone using unconventional as a polite word for something less polite. Yes, Priyanka agreed. The collective's standard behavioral research protocols exist for reasons. They are the result of centuries of peer-reviewed, institutionally validated. They're missing quiet signaling, Priyanka said. Not rudely, not with heat, just factually. All of them. The foundational Tsuvari framework from the third expansion period defines behavioral significance by intensity threshold, which means anything below a certain signal strength gets categorized as background noise. But for at least a third of the species on these decks, the sub-threshold range is where most of the actual communication is happening. Orrakh's threat assessment behavior operates almost entirely in that range, which is why every researcher who approached his habitat read him as unpredictably aggressive. They were only seeing the responses, not the buildup. The buildup is quiet. If you know to look for it, it's not unpredictable at all. The room was doing that held breath thing again. Kelethos opened his mouth, paused, and closed it, which was, honestly, the most interesting thing he contributed to the meeting. Omarvan, who had been watching all of this from the head of the table with the expression of a man running complex internal calculations, leaned forward. Researcher Morrow, he said. Page 208. The proposed integration protocol for Orrakh. You're suggesting direct habitat entry. Yes. No researcher has entered that habitat since his intake assessment 3 years ago. I know. The intake assessment went badly because the assessment team used a standard Ruvath approach protocol, which involves direct eye contact and a slow advance, and Orrakh is not a standard Ruvath. His behavioral profile is more consistent with solitary apex predators from the Nessic systems than with standard Ruvath pack socialized individuals. Direct eye contact reads as challenge. He doesn't want confrontation. He wants to evaluate whether you're worth his attention. If you approach correctly, he'll allow contact. Another silence. Then Yusuf, who had been quiet in the corner for the entire meeting, said mildly, "She's been standing at his barrier for 5 weeks. He hasn't displayed once." Several heads turned. Kelethos looked like he was doing arithmetic. He didn't like the answer to. Omarvan looked at Priyanka for a long moment. "You want to go in?" "Yes. Today," she considered. "If that's possible, yes. There is a specific kind of institutional momentum that builds when someone quietly correct encounters someone institutionally powerful who is paying attention. It does not look dramatic from the outside. It looks like a series of very calm decisions made in a short period of time." Omarvan approved the entry protocol within the hour. Dr. Savara filed the observation request. A medical team was stationed outside the habitat on a non-emergency basis, standard procedure, they said. though the medical team was under no illusions about what they were actually there for. 20 people gathered at the observation level above Orrakh's habitat that afternoon. Some of them had professional reasons to be there. Most of them had the reason that every being in the galaxy shares, the simple, irresistible pull of wanting to see what happens next. Priyanka entered through the secondary access corridor, alone. She was carrying nothing except her notebook, no protective equipment, no deterrent devices, nothing that would read as either defensive or aggressive in Revered behavioral language. She stood at the inner corridor entrance for a moment, letting her eyes adjust, letting him see that she was there. Orrakh was at the far end of the habitat. 4 meters of armored mass, absolutely still, secondary eyes open and tracking her heat signature, primary gaze somewhere in the middle distance, not looking directly at her, not looking away. She walked forward. Not slow, not fast, the pace of someone going somewhere specific without urgency. She stopped approximately 6 meters from him, sat down on the floor, opened her notebook, and began writing. For 6 minutes, nothing happened. On the observation level, someone who was not a human held their breath, actually held it, biologically could not remember to exhale. Then, Orrakh moved. Not fast, not threatening. He shifted his weight, that left side weight shift she'd noted on the first day, and he walked toward her. Not all the way, halfway, and then he stopped, lowered his head to a non-aggressive angle, and made a sound deep in his chest that the recording equipment captured at a frequency barely within the audible range of most species in the room above. Dr. Savara, watching, went very still. The sound was in the sub-threshold range. Priyanka looked up from her notebook. She made a sound back, a low, brief, non-vocal sound, something between an exhale and a hum, that she had apparently reverse-engineered from weeks of observational data, and that Savara, in a paper she would publish 14 months later, would describe as the most accurate cross-species acoustic approximation of a Revered proximity acknowledgement ever recorded by a non-Revered researcher. Orrakh looked at her for a long moment. Then he lay down, 6 meters away, plates settling flat, eyes half closed. The room above was absolutely silent. Then Brenna's mate, in the adjacent habitat, the one nobody had named because nobody had ever gotten close enough to feel comfortable naming him, pressed himself against the shared wall nearest to Priyanka's position, and made a sound that Savara's notation system had never previously categorized. Priyanka wrote it down. She was in the habitat for 2 hours. When she came out, she walked straight to Yusuf, who was waiting in the corridor, and said without preamble, "Orrakh is in early-stage cognitive decline from social isolation. It's not aggression, it's distress. He needs regular proximity contact from a consistent individual. I'd like to propose a care protocol." Yusuf looked at her for a moment. He had spent 22 years being politely tolerated by institutions that considered humanity a footnote, and he had a very specific expression he wore when something shifted. Not surprise, exactly. More like the quiet satisfaction of a long prediction coming true. "Write it up," he said. "Omarvin will read it today." She nodded, turned to go, then paused. "Can I get a terminal update? Mine is 6 years out of date. I'll have it replaced by morning." She nodded again and walked away. "And I want to tell you, I want you to appreciate that she walked away the exact same way she'd walked in. Same pace, same posture, the same complete absence of performance. Because here is the thing, and this is the part that the collective never quite managed to put in a report. Priyanka Morrow had not spent 5 weeks quietly working while being overlooked because she was waiting for her moment, or building toward a reveal, or playing any kind of strategic game. She had been doing it because the animals needed it done, and she was the one who knew how to do it, and the question of whether anyone was watching was genuinely completely irrelevant to her. That is the part that broke the Tsuvari behavioral framework more thoroughly than any of the academic arguments ever could. The collective had 600 years of research built on the assumption that significance signals itself, that things that matter announce themselves loudly, that importance wears its importance visibly. And then a 26-year-old human in outdated field clothes sat down on the floor of an apex predator's habitat and rewrote 4 centuries of xenobehavioral assumption by simply not needing anyone to see her do it. Omarvin formally requested her research for peer review 3 days later. The paper, co-authored with Savara, was accepted to the Galactic Xenobehavioral Review in 11 months, the fastest acceptance in the journal's 200-year history. Kelithos submitted a commentary response that was technically polite and contained, between every carefully constructed line, the energy of a man deeply reconsidering several life choices. Orrakh, on the first day of his new care protocol, walked directly to the habitat barrier when Priyanka entered the corridor and waited there until she reached him. Savara stood on the observation level with her recording equipment and documented the whole thing, and also which did not make it into the official record, stood very still for a long time afterward, with the bioluminescent patterns on her neck, doing something that the Velhari would privately describe to each other for years as the expression Savara made the day she understood what humanity actually was. And somewhere in the Grand Senate of the Galactic Collective, above the carved entrance, the old saying still read, "Never mistake silence for weakness." It had been there for 400 years, and for the first time in a long time, every word of it was true.